Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, February 9th, 2023. All right, so the first story at the top of antiwar.com, how America took out the Nord Stream pipeline. This is a huge story. This is from Seymour Hersh, the legendary investigative journalist. And he put this out on his Substack on Wednesday morning, this long report that details how the U.S. destroyed the Nord Stream pipelines. Just very explosive allegations in this report. And it says that U.S. Navy divers planted C4 explosives on the Nord Stream pipelines last June, in June 2022, during NATO exercises known as the Balt Ops 22. This was done in coordination with Norway. And then in September, when the explosion was discovered, it was a Norwegian spy plane that detonated these explosives by dropping some sort of sonar buoy that sent a signal. So again, very explosive allegations here. Of course, the White House and the CIA have denied them. And he cites one source with direct knowledge of the operational planning. And, Hersh, if you're not familiar with him, he has a lot. He's widely revered. He exposed the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. He exposed U.S. torture at the Abu Ghraib prison. He has a very long track record of being reliable. So just to go through some of these details, now there's a lot to this. I would advise everybody to go read it. It's about 5,000 words. I'm sure a lot of you already have or have already heard about this. But really, what I think some of the major things to just hit here is the planning of it. Because the planning started, according to this source, before Russia invaded Ukraine. It says that, while Russia was building up troops around Ukraine, the U.S. was worried that it couldn't get its allies like Germany that rely on Russia. If there's a war, wouldn't be able to get them to supply Ukraine with money and weapons, and that they had to worry about the Nord Stream pipeline. So this says that President Biden ordered Jake Sullivan, or authorized Jake Sullivan, his national security advisor, to bring together an interagency group to come up with a plan, and all options were on the table. So basically, in December 2021, so a few months before the invasion, Jake Sullivan convened a meeting of a newly formed task force, men and women from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA, the state, and Treasury departments, and asked for recommendations. And during these meetings, I guess, is when they were discussing how to attack the Nord Stream pipelines. And he says the players in this plan, of course, Victoria Nuland, Antony Blinken, and Jake Sullivan. And they debated options for attack over several meetings. And the CIA came back. Importantly, his source here says that everybody understood that it had to be untraceable because it's an act of war. That's what it is. It's an attack on Russian energy infrastructure. There's no way around it. This is an act of war. So the CIA came back and said that they had a way to do it. Again, there's tons of details here. And it was through planting the C4 explosives. And then something interesting happened. And this is really interesting, the way that he reports how this went down. He said the CIA came back, said we have a way to blow up the pipelines. And what came next was stunning. On February 7th, less than 3 weeks before the seemingly inevitable Russian invasion of Ukraine, Biden met in his White House office with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who, after some wobbling, was now firmly on the American team. At the press briefing that followed, Biden defiantly said, quote, "If Russia invades, there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it," end quote. Now, this is a quote that was brought up right after the explosion, Biden threatening the pipeline. And Nuland, a few weeks earlier, made a similar threat. She said, one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward. And then several of those involved in the planning of the pipeline mission were dismayed by what they viewed as indirect references to the attack. This source described it like putting an atomic bomb on the ground in Tokyo and telling the Japanese that we're going to detonate it. Um, and now this is really amazing here. So now that they're saying that this indiscretion, it frustrated them, but it created an opportunity because according to the source, some of the senior officials of the CIA determined that blowing up the pipeline no longer could be considered a covert operation because the president just announced that we knew how to do it. The plan to blow up Nord Stream 1 and 2 was suddenly downgraded from a covert operation requiring that Congress be informed to one that was deemed as a highly classified intelligence operation with U.S. military support. And under the law, we don't have to tell Congress, even though it's an act of war against the world's largest nuclear power. So again, I mean, this is just huge. And again, Norway cooperated, according to this source. And there's so much here to go over, but that's really the big points here is that the United States planned this and they're saying Biden ordered it. I mean, this is, because I always lean towards, I figured the US was responsible, either they directed it or backed it, but I kind of lean towards one of, their allies doing it instead, to like a proxy just to keep the US more separated from it. Because this is just really unbelievable. And again, it's just an act of war against Russia. So now, again, all the denials, I think it's going to be tough, to get if this is going to be really confirmed. I think the best bet that we have is the European side, somebody in Germany that might not be too happy about this, or in Norway, maybe, or maybe, just maybe, some reporters at the New York Times or something that have sources are going to see this and think, because it's such a huge deal, that it needs to be investigated more thoroughly. So maybe some reporter that, in DC that has the connections that could really confirm this is going to decide that it's worthy of confirming. And I believe that if it is, then this really rips the mask off the whole thing and shows how aggressive the Biden administration is toward Russia. And maybe it would have to force them to back down. I hope. I don't know, but trying to look at the positive side of this somehow. So Russia's response was kind of muted more so than I thought it would be. But they're saying that they need answers, and the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova wrote on Telegram, quote, "The White House must now comment on all these facts," end quote. So again, the White House dismissed it, calling Hersh's work a complete fiction. So in this article, I kind of just summarize the Seymour Hersh one. But one thing I also mentioned is the media coverage. So right after the Nord Stream pipelines blew up, of course, there was all this work by the media to say, oh, it was Russia, even though Russia had no motive. They owned the pipeline. Putin had all the leverage in the world with those pipelines, being able to turn them on and off. Again, no reason they would do it, but that's not what the media tried to tell people. But then recently, both the New York Times and the Washington Post acknowledged that there's no evidence tying it to Russia. They said a lot of people don't think it was Russia. And then just recently, the Times of London, they reported last week that Germany is open to theories that a Western country attacked the Nord Stream pipelines in an attempt to blame the incident on Russia. And Sweden, Denmark, and Germany have been investigating the sabotage, and they haven't shared any details. They haven't blamed anybody. And these reports say that's very strange. A lot of Western, so I think there might be enough momentum that we could get some sort of confirmation from, newspapers that the Biden administration would have to admit, aren't just making this up. With Seymour Hersh, it's really amazing because he represents what journalism really should be in the U.S. and kind of what it used to be. But now, you have all these journalists, mainstream journalists, kind of already trying to smear him and say, he's wrong and go to bat for the American government instead of taking his side and saying, you guys have to answer for this, and trying to figure out more ways to confirm it. To try to end this war, because I think that's what it could lead to. A huge revelation like this could be big enough to really, turn the tide, I think. And of course, U.S. officials openly celebrated the Nord Stream bombings, including Blinken, who called it a tremendous opportunity to wean Europe off Russian gas. And Victoria Nuland recently said that she and others in the administration were happy that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was just a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea. So, again, we'll see how this all plays out. Um, I didn't look too hard, but I didn't see a response from Norway. That's something I got to really look into. But again, we'll see with the we might see some stuff in Europe. I wouldn't be surprised. But all right, so the next one here, the UK says that it will train Ukrainian pilots on fighter jets. So Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, he visited the UK on Wednesday, marking his first trip to the country since Russia's invasion, and he pleaded for London to provide Kiev with fighter jets in a speech to the British Parliament. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak appears ready to oblige Zelensky's request. He asked his defense minister, Ben Wallace, to look at providing fighter jets to Kiev as part of long-term support for Ukraine. A spokesman for Sunak said that Wallace is now actively looking at whether we send jets. The spokesman said, quote, the prime minister has tasked the defense secretary with investigating what jets we might be able to give, but to be clear, this is a long-term solution, end quote. So far, they say they're looking at it. There hasn't been a commitment for the UK to send jets, but Sunak says they're going to start training Ukrainian pilots. So they're going to get the ball rolling anyway, and they're expected to start training them this spring. Sunak said while Zelensky was there, quote, I am proud that today we will expand the training from soldiers to Marines and fighter jet pilots, ensuring Ukraine has a military able to defend its interests well into the future, end quote. So Sunak's spokesman said that they expect to receive the first Ukrainians for pilot training this spring. I just repeated myself there. So the UK has trained a lot of Ukrainian soldiers already. They say they've trained 10,000 and they want to bring that number up to 20,000 in 2023. So it looks like, eventually they're going to start sending these fighter jets, and the US still hasn't committed, but it doesn't, even if they say that they're not going to do it, it doesn't mean anything because they've said that a lot about a lot of other things that they're now sending to Ukraine. I mean, Sunak's government just said like a week or two ago that, oh yeah, sending fighter jets doesn't make sense. But then the defense minister said that they couldn't rule it out. So we continue along this escalatory spiral that is another step closer to a direct NATO and Russia war. If we're not in one already. But Zelensky, he hopped over to Paris right after he was in London. In this next article here, he tells Macron and Scholz to supply game-changing weapons. So he had dinner with Macron and Scholz in Paris on Wednesday night after his visit to London, and he made a fresh pitch for fighter jets and other advanced weapons. Zelensky said, quote, France and Germany have the potential to be game changers, and that's how I see our talks today. The sooner we get heavy long-range weapons and our pilots get modern planes, the quicker this Russian aggression will end, end quote. Zelensky said the weapons are needed for peace, reflecting recent comments by Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, who claimed sending more arms to Ukraine is the quickest path to peace. Scholz told Zelensky, this is the German chancellor, he told Zelensky that Germany and its allies will back Ukraine for as long as necessary, but he didn't give an indication that he's changed his position on jets. He said recently that they're not going to send jets, but he also ruled out sending tanks, and now Ukraine could receive over 200 German-made tanks, the Leopard 1 and the Leopard 2. That really depends how many of the Leopard 1s that are able to be restored, fixed up to be able to send to Ukraine. There's 178. It's not clear if all of them are going to be able to be sent over there. But again, they say they're not going to do something, they turn around and do it. And speaking alongside Zelensky, Macron said that Russia must not win the war and that Kiev could rely on France. Zelensky traveled to Paris again after traveling to London and Wednesday. So he visited London, and that's his first known trip outside of Ukraine since Russia invaded, except for his visit to D.C. in December when he addressed Congress and got a lot more people to clap for him than Biden did at his State of the Union address. Um, oh, and he's going to Brussels on Thursday to attend some sort of EU summit, and he's going to be asking for more weapons there, I am sure. The next one, Roger Waters, our friend and supporter, the co-founder of Pink Floyd, he spoke at the UN Security Council on Wednesday, and he called for a ceasefire. So we just put the video up of his speech, so you can go check that out. It's pretty cool. And the next one here, Rep. McCaul plans to visit Taiwan this spring, and McCarthy will visit later. So Michael McCaul, Republican from Texas, he's the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He said that he plans to lead a bipartisan congressional delegation to Taiwan this spring, despite the risk of provoking China. He said, quote, "I think it's important to show China that we support Taiwan as a deterrence. I think it's important to do that," end quote. So while all this increasing support for Taiwan is done in the name of deterrence, all it has done is increase Chinese military pressure on the island. After Pelosi went, the former House Speaker, she went when she was House Speaker last August, provoked the largest ever military exercises around Taiwan. It's not deterrence. China views congressional visits to Taiwan as an affront to the One China policy, especially when the Speaker of the House is involved. But the increased tensions as a result of Pelosi's trip did not deter her successor, Kevin McCarthy, who also plans to make the trek to Taipei. So a source told Bloomberg that McCaul's visit will likely take place in April, and then McCarthy's trip is going to come after that. Again, he's the House Speaker, either later this year or sometime in 2024. And of course, McCarthy had to say, China can't tell me where I can go. We're going to see more provoking of China over the next year by these members of Congress, and they're going to be pushing Biden to be more hawkish on China, even though he is very hawkish. So tensions are really going to escalate in that regard. Let's see what is next here. Oh, China says that it was smeared during Biden's State of the Union address. So China responded to Biden saying that competition with China should unite, all of us, is how he put it. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning basically said that competition should not be the defining characteristic of U.S.-China relations. She said, quote, "It is beneath a responsible country to use competition as a pretext to smear other countries and restrain their legitimate right to development, even at the expense of global industrial and supply chains," end quote. So she's referring there to the sanctions, because in that speech, Biden said, we're investing. That's how we're going to beat China. But he's also sanctioning them and signing bills, basically corporate welfare, to subsidize investment, to subsidize, chip manufacturing, that big chip bill that they made. U.S.-China relations, of course, are at their lowest point in decades as the U.S. has been increasing sanctions, expanding its military footprint in the Asia-Pacific, and boosting support for Taiwan. Mao Ning said that she said, quote, "A healthy and stable China-U.S. relationship is in the fundamental interest of both peoples," end quote. So the rhetoric, that you see from Chinese officials is much different than what we see from the U.S. I think it's worth pointing out because the U.S. and China, they recently made an effort to increase dialogue. That's all kind of gone by the wayside since the big balloon incident. But before those meetings, the U.S. would say, "Oh yeah, we think we got to do this to manage the competition with China." And China says, that they want to, kind of fix relations, but the U.S. isn't viewing it like that. They're not even saying that. They're really trying to resolve issues. So more about the balloon. I mean, since it was shot down, apparently Lloyd Austin tried to phone his Chinese counterpart after a U.S. F-22 shot down the balloon, not before or anything. And Pentagon officials say that Beijing did not accept the call. So, it seems like all that progress, there was some progress made there when it comes to dialogue between the U.S. and China after Pelosi kind of ruined everything, because when she went, China suspended these military hotlines, I guess, and dialogues that they have, and then they agreed to resume them, and then the balloon thing happens and the U.S. shoots it down. So things. And of course, Blinken cancels his trip because he is just very bad at his job at being a diplomat. All right, the next one. So I just left up the one about the Syrian Red Crescent saying that sanctions need to be lifted to deal with the earthquake, which has now killed over 15,000 people. So that's a real man. It just keeps going up. We just have the Al Jazeera live updates here. So right now, more than 15,000 and at least 12,391 have died in Turkey, and 2,992 have been killed in Syria. And I mean, the reason I'm really focusing on this sanctions thing because it's just such a practical thing that the U.S. could do to help the situation. Just in general, I mean, before the earthquake, the sanctions were having a really bad impact on civilians, really hurting people. But now even more so. Um, and there is pressure growing. This one article I put up here, this is from the Catholic News Agency. Christian leaders in Syria call for an end to unjust sanctions that they say hamper aid to the needy. So, three prominent Christian leaders in Syria issued a joint letter Tuesday calling for an end to sanctions against Syria, which they say are unjustly preventing vital aid from reaching the people most affected by the devastating earthquake that struck the region earlier this week. The February 7th letter was signed by the Greek Catholic Patriarch, the Syrian Orthodox Patriarch, and the Greek Orthodox Patriarch. They said, quote, "This natural disaster adds to the ordeal of the Syrian people who continue to suffer from the tragedies of war, crisis, disasters, epidemic, and the harsh economic hardships resulting from inflation, the absence of indispensable materials, medications, and daily basic necessities needed in order for people to survive and live in dignity. We, the three patriarchs with the heads of churches in Syria, demand from the United Nations and the countries imposing sanctions on Syria to lift the embargo and unjust sanctions imposed on the Syrian people and to take exceptional measures and immediate initiatives to secure the delivery of the much needed relief and humanitarian aid." End quote. And there's other calls, and it's some I'm going to really keep an eye on. And again, Blinken himself has said, our great diplomat, that the U.S. policy is to oppose the reconstruction of Syria. The sanctions are specifically designed to prevent them from rebuilding after a war. So they're also going to prevent them from rebuilding after an earthquake. Just such a cruel policy. Okay, so the last one here. This is from Brett Wilkins. A new report unpacks the dangers of emerging military tech, from AI nukes to killer robots. So this is a report from the Arms Control Association, and this is a topic I kind of feel like I don't cover enough, is like futuristic weapons and arms control when it comes, and just kind of the implication of all this stuff, because this is a big part of the US and China and what the Pentagon is doing, to what they say to compete with China. They're investing in research and development of all these new weapons technologies, and a lot of them are very scary. So, emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence, lethal autonomous weapon systems, and hypersonic missiles, pose a potentially existential threat that underscores the imperative of arms control measures to slow the pace of weaponization, according to a new report published on Thursday. So, the Arms Control Association report, entitled "Assessing the Dangers Emerging Military Technologies and Nuclear Instability," unpacks the concept of emerging technologies and summarizes the debate over their utilization for military purposes and their impact on strategic stability. The publication notes that the world's military powers have sought to exploit advanced technologies, artificial intelligence, autonomy, cyber, and hypersonics, among others, to gain battlefield advantages, but warns too little has been done about the dangers these weapons represent. Again, I mean, that's really the gist of it, is that, they're kind of going head on into developing all these weapons. And, it comes at a time when uh, relations between, of course, the US and Russia and the US and China are just so low right now that, there's not going to be any kind of coordination on making killer robots and AI and things like that. So I think it is pretty concerning when we think about, if there is a future war between these powers and it doesn't just go nuclear right away, it could be, some really nasty weapons and technology could be involved, or maybe they could just have the robots fight it out, so no people have to die. But yeah, and space. I mean, the weaponization of space is another thing that freaks me out. And once they start shooting down satellites and stuff, I mean, where could that lead? But that's it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have run from Ted Galen Carpenter's that says Zelensky is Washington's new Jonas Savimbi. I definitely pronounced that wrong, but he's an Angolan rebel leader that the U.S. supported back in the 70s and 80s. And, he just draws a parallel between them, how the U.S., ignores the bad about both of them. One from Trenton Hale, how the media ignores Yemen. Go check that out. One from Christopher Caldwell. Oh, so this is worth mentioning because this is over at the New York Times. And it's from Christopher Caldwell, who I'm not too familiar with. But I know he's a columnist over there. I don't know much about him. I meant to kind of look into him a little more. I'm pretty sure he used to write for the Weekly Standard, which was like the neocon outlet leading up to the invasion of Iraq. But so this is titled Russia and Ukraine have incentives to negotiate and the US has other plans. And one thing that was really striking to me was how he described the US sending tanks. He said the Biden strategy has a bad name, escalation. Beyond a certain point, the United States is no longer helping or advising or supplying the Ukrainians the way it did, say the Afghan Mujahideen during the Cold War. It is replacing Ukraine as Russia's main battlefield adversary. It is hard to say when that point will be reached or whether it has been already. With whom is Russia at war, Ukraine or the United States? Russia started the war between Russia and Ukraine. Who started the war between Russia and the United States? So, the fact that questions like that are being asked in the pages of the New York Times just shows how dangerous this situation is. One from Patrick McFarland over at the Libertarian Institute about the balloon, crisis. It's titled "An Overblown Balloon Headline Inflates False Narrative on China." So this is a very good article, asking the questions about this balloon and pointing out a lot of the falsehoods in the narrative about China. When it comes to things like TikTok and this idea that they're purchasing up all U.S. farmland when they barely account less than 0.5% of all foreign-owned land in the U.S. is owned by Chinese firms. So that's just a non-issue that you always hear about. But yeah, that's it. Hopefully, I covered that Seymour Hersh piece thoroughly enough and hit the important details. But again, I think people should really go read that. It's really something, and we'll see how it shakes out. But you could always support us at antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe to the show on YouTube, Odyssey, and Rumble. Share it around. That's it for me for today. Actually, I got to mention something else. I keep forgetting that the upcoming rally in Washington, D.C., the Rage Against the War Machine rally, it's going to be on February 19th at the Lincoln Memorial. So try to get there. There's a great lineup of speakers. Ron Paul is going to be there in person. That was recently announced. Jimmy Dore, Scott Horton's going to be representing us. And there's just a ton of other great people. So try to get there if you can. But that's it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.